Okay, folks. Obviously, it's the session after lunchtime, and so I'll try to keep you entertained as we go through the food coma together. My name's Andrew Vanderstock. I am a senior principal consultant at Synopsys. I look after the managed services area, which means that from the point of view of technical things, so quality, the checklists, and you'll see the reason why in a tick. I have been at OWASP since 2002, and late 2002. I wasn't there at the very, very beginning, but I know who was. The reality is that I've done a lot of things for OWASP over the years. It's probably too much to mention. I've only got 45 minutes. The main ones of note is the OWASP Top 10. We recently released the OWASP Top 10 2017, and I'm going to convince you not to use it. Okay? So let's get going. So what is the Application Security Verification Standard? Unlike the OWASP Top 10, it's an actual standard. You can actually comply with it. Now, being a standard will actually mean that it's one of those areas that we're trying to move towards generally accepted security practices. Those things that should become the norm, not necessarily those things that have been traditionally done. And we're going to talk about those as we go through the different controls. For example, in authentication, we're going to talk about password rotation and my opinions on that. So fundamentally, as we go through, you'll see that we've actually adopted a lot of things. The size of the checklist is now considerably bigger than it used to be. And so it's important for you to realize you don't have to do the entire thing. You can pick and choose what you want, okay? So we've got some great things coming up. It is community and it is industry driven. Industry in that we basically do like to hear from the people who are actively using the ASVS every day. And in fact, in the 2.0 release, we found out that one of the tax officers from a European country was actually using the ASVS for all of their application security efforts. And we're extraordinarily happy about that. And in fact, those folks have actually contributed things like the web services chapter. So this is an example of where it was a bi-directional feedback. We gave them some checklists, they gave us some checklists back, and it made the entire thing better. It's completely open at GitHub. Now, I promised that we would release the ASVS 4.0 on stage. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, when this happens, the ASVS will be published on GitHub. Okay. Got to know how to use GitHub. Okay, once that's done, ASVS is launched. So you can get it too while we're doing this talk. So now you've seen the power of publishing in the open. And in fact, for the last week or so, you could have seen a very close to final version. You could have generated it yourself. You could have started working with it yourself. We do rely upon people to review and whatnot, so we'll talk about that in a tick. What does it actually look like? It looks like this. This is just a sampling of controls. You can see there, this is the beginning of the authentication chapter. And we actually have some controls here, such as verify the user set passwords are at least 12 characters in length. Now, we did try to align with NIST 800-63, and we've done a lot in that area. Unfortunately, their advice was for 8 characters, but 8 characters, we can now run through all 8-character passwords in 2.5 hours for NTLM. So, no, not 8. So if you're doing single-factor authentication, it's 12. Fundamentally, this is one of those areas that we have to keep on moving and pushing people forward. We are a leading-edge standard. Version 2 was even difficult for people to do. So who's involved? My number one person involved is you. I want you to review. I want you to contribute. I want you to think about what it is. If there's something that's not able to be complied with, if there is something that is actually too difficult to use on a regular basis, submit a ticket. We'll get it fixed. We're committing now to doing point releases maybe every 3 to 6 months to fix up those little tiny bugs. The next major release will probably be in around 2 to 3 years' time, okay? So this had to be looking forward to 2022, and so we're pushing the envelope. You'll see things in here that you may not be familiar with, and that is okay, because by 2022, it will not be unfamiliar. We've had some amazing reviewers. Ilalang, Osama, what's his surname? El Nagar, Ron Perez, Tonomir Kassondi, Serge Belclomen, Jason Axley, Adam Caldwell. These guys, between them, submitted over 200 tickets. And an amazing amount of work went into, some very careful thought went into what they wanted. And in fact, with Ella and Osama, we actually had replacement verification text, which was much better. So this is the power of that community-driven spirit. So think about how many times do people here have to comply with something like ISO 27002? Yeah? You know that went through a committee, and the committee kept on watering it down and down and down until everyone agreed. Yeah? We actually, in the ASVS, we have conceptual integrity. We want to be the best web app and web service standard there is. Bar none, no excuses. We don't water things down. Sometimes we're a little aggressive, and that's okay, because we're open, you can fork us, and you can make it your own. So what's new? Quite a lot. We basically have completely transferred into Markdown. This is really good. Not only does it help with translations, so say for example, there's currently an effort to translate this into Hindi. Once that Hindi translation is done, they can then track any changes that we make. We might make 1 or 2 character changes here and there. We might make a paragraph here or there. With GitHub, we can actually give them the complete list of what changed since they last translated and now, and that will speed up their translation effort by orders of magnitude. Also, because it's translatable, we will then find out from coming back from translations, was it hard to translate? And if it's hard to translate, it's probably difficult in English as well, and we can make it a simpler thing. That's when it's really good. NIST 800-63, I've got a slide coming up on that. I won't talk about it now. We also have the Internet of Things preview chapter. This was going to be built into the ASVS, but we decided that our focus had to be web apps and web services. What we want to do is create an ecosystem of thing verification standards that leverages us as a base level, and then taking out all of the duplicate controls, their part that's interesting to them, like mobile or IoT, will be a much smaller guide, and therefore we can actually leverage that. One of the other things that I'm just going to mention about 863, we went out of our way to make it easy for people who are doing ISO 27002, PCI DSS 3.2.1, and OWASP Top 10 to comply with us. We don't have competing strategies. NIST 800-63, we are absolutely aligned. We're a little in excess of where they are, but the reality is that all the other ones are catching up to NIST 800-63, and ISO 27002, the next generation, will catch up. So we do deal with modern web apps. Last 3.01, we did have support for responsive web apps and some APIs, but it was difficult for those applications to really translate it through. We now have full support for serverless and responsive web applications. We also talk about the idea that there is no server-side architecture anymore. It's really important to understand that we've gone through and weeded out all of those areas that assume that you own a server in a data center that's yours. We've taken that constraint out, okay? You still can make secure software in that way. We have completed the CWE mapping. CWE is a problem. We are a controls-based standard. These are the things we want you to do. The weaknesses enumeration is a list of everything that could go bad, but not really. It's missing about, in our case, roughly around 15 to 20% of the issues that we have no corresponding CWE. And in fact, even this morning, when I noticed there was a mistake in one of the chapters, I had to go back and read that. There was 2 different CWEs. Both of them were relevant. I had to interpret the differences between CWE 94 and CWE 116. And in the end, it went to CWE 159. These are very closely overlapping, and it's no wonder we have troubles when people align their tools to CWE and say, we want you to do CWE. Well, yes, we do CWE, but it's our best guess as to the best match. Hopefully by setting down a standard like this, we can start to get the tool vendors on board with our desired mapping, which means we may be wrong, but everyone's going to be wrong the same way. So I would suggest, let's help CWE out. It's a volunteer-driven thing. You can submit new CWEs, and there's a process to get published. We can help in both establishing new CWEs, but also helping in the editing. Do reach out to our colleagues at MITRE and see what we can do for them. What's changed? Everything. We renumber completely. If you have a previous version of the ASVS, there is no one-to-one mapping. And in fact, finding the previous items may be tricky because we reworded a great deal of them. The reason why we had to do that is that we had gaps. We deliberately designed gaps into 1, 2, 3, so that people who had pen tests done in 2009 could compare them against pen tests done in 2017. Okay? When we retired controls, we didn't reuse its number. The reality is that we had so many numbers that as soon as we realized that we were hitting .50 in a couple of the chapters, and we previously told people, forecasts, make your controls .50 and above, we'll never get there. Well, we got there in this release. So we had to renumber in a different way. And once we started down that process, it made no sense whatsoever to keep the previous numbering. So this gives us a lot of headroom, and you'll see from here, it's 3 levels. So even it'll take us a long time to exhaust all of those. 640K is enough for everyone, right? Okay, we deduped. This means that in the past, you might have been able to use the API chapter and just the API chapter, and that's it. No, we've really gone to town, and if it has the same CWE number as something in another section, and they belong in that different section, it's where it's gone. So a lot of API authentication is now in the authentication chapter. You have to use all of the chapters. L1 is the new minimum. The OWASP Top 10 is the beginning checklist for everybody. It's where you start your application security journey. As I wrote in the foreword to the 2007 edition, it is an awareness piece, it is not a standard. Then PCI DSS immediately included us into the PCI DSS standard. So you can sort of see where things started to go wrong. It is not sufficient. You can still get hacked. The breaches that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years have been tremendously large, and it is a failure of the industry to help folks build secure software. We can't patch our way out of this. We need to build secure software. So level 1, we deliberately decided to do this. It was actually a difficult decision because level 1 now has 167 things in it. And so if you think from a pen test list that has 167 things, what do I do? Well, time box your efforts. The reality is that not all of them are equal. You don't have to do all of them. If you don't have JWT, the JWT section does not apply to you. But level 1 is deliberately pen testable. Every single one of those controls, you can get in there and do a black box. We highly recommend against doing penetration testing, says the person who looks after penetration testers, a lot of them. We've got to get to a place where, and I'd love to be able to do this, hybrid code reviews. Essentially, you do a pen test that's led by code. You can see the assumptions that are made in the code. You can find things you would never find using automatic scanners. I would like to get to a place where automatic scanners, you're running them as part of your CI/CD process, and therefore there's no point in actually making level 1 any less than what we have. I would like to see people, if they have an SSRF problem, to be able to identify an SSRF problem because it is in level 1, okay? Give them the code, let them find it, give them a non-production database so they can absolutely hammer the application and get it done. Hybrid reviews at least. I've talked about that. To get PCI DSS 6.5 compliance, we've had to add back memory controls such as buffer overflows and integer overflows and all those wonderful things. There's about 4 or 5 of them. And what this means is that before, the ASVS was good for 9 out of the 10 things in section 6.5. We're now good for all 10. And so we're going to work with PCI DSS. I would really like them to replace that section with a reference to us, and then for them to identify the controls that they truly care about in relation to the payments industry, because they are controls. It's not a weakness, okay? So That's a discussion for the future. They've just released a new guide. We referenced it as a reference. It was released too late for us to include any real references to it. What's gone? We got rid of a bunch of less impactful controls. For example, I went through the Google has a vulnerability management program that you can actually submit bugs through bug bounties and get paid, $1,337 if you find something interesting, or a lot of money if you find a sandbox bypass. They have a list of rules of things they don't accept. I went through that list and I agreed with most of them, so I eliminated them from the ASVS. Okay, we no longer look for things and headers that you cannot get you hacked. It's really important that we actually did that. To make room for CWE, since when? Okay, V1 architecture got completely rewritten. All of the things that were architecturally related in the previous versions are now in architecture. And what this means is that these are encompassing things that you have to build in from scratch. These are the things that if you had to do it after the fact, you were never going to do it. You're going to rewrite the software. So there's not many of them, but it's an important section. The first item, I think now that I've published it, you might know what it is. What do you reckon the first item of the security architecture chapter is? What's the basis for producing secure software? What do you need to be able to do that? You need a secure SDLC. Item number 1.1.1 of the ASVS 4.0 is you must have a secure SDLC. It's a prerequisite. You cannot produce secure software without it. We demand it. We don't care which one you use, just pick one and go for it. We also require threat modeling. That's the second control. Now, these are level 2 controls. Pen tests, you can't do this as a pen test. It's a level 2 control. You need to work with the developers. We also require people to design and document their decisions. We don't necessarily want big design up front. What we are expecting is, as you build the software, Confluence or other wikis contain the information about your product. Okay? Authentication. I'll give you a little story. Does anyone know how password rotation came about? I've told this story a few times, so apologies if you've heard it before. In 1978 and 1979, two researchers by the name of Morris and Kernighan, you might know their names, used a PDP-8 at night time and on weekends in single user mode to crack DES unsalted passwords. And they were able to do it in 31 days for around 40% of the passwords. This is in the days that you could actually have passwords like ABC. Now, they came up with a range of controls, including using one-way hashing and salting the passwords. Okay, that eventually came around. It took BSD, another 9 or 10 years before it was part of the base operating system. But guess what was one of the recommendations they put in there that they just said does not work and you should not do? Just rotate the passwords. And they said, if you're going to do it, you have to do it every 30 days. For a PDP-8, my mobile phone is billions of times faster than PDP-8. You cannot change your password fast enough. And even the algorithm they use, DES, they weren't even aware of the shortcut that gets rid of half of all DES challenges. And if they'd known that, it would have taken them 15 days. And then it would have become obvious that password rotation does not work. And yet, I bet, how many people here have to change their password every 90 days? Okay, we've got to stop doing it. NIST 800-63 says you don't do it at all. It's prohibited. We say it's prohibited, as is password complexity. We substitute multi-factor authentication and longer passwords. We also mandate that the application must allow password managers. I have 460 unique passwords. They are all 20 plus characters long unless the site does not allow me to have long passwords. We basically say that you're not compliant with the ASVS if you don't have those basics. Because we know that there was a Forbes article 2 days ago, 74% of all of the breaches in the last year came from credentials that have been published. And credential stuffing is now the major attack on most web apps. Okay, we can no longer afford to ignore the reality that passwords today are done. We need to get to a place where you cannot crack them, you cannot recover them, you store them correctly, and you have multi-factor authentication. One of the other ones that we have is we've actually said that your FIDO support. NIST has this as well. We want to make sure that if a person has a multi-factor token and it's possible to reuse that token. I have 3 on me right now. Not FIDO tokens, but tokens in general. And then, for example, on my phone, which is around here somewhere, I'll find it later, it has 8 or 9 soft tokens. There should be a possibility of reusing the tokens. And without that possibility, the multi-factor becomes really untenable. If you have 460 tokens for 460 accounts, it's not going to work. Session management, we now deal with JWT. We deal with all the different versions of API authentication, including SAML. We have cookie-based and all the wonderful things. We document a new attack that's being actively used out in the financial services land. It is a half-open attack. It uses a pattern where when you start to reset a password or you start to do the forget username password, it brings in the complete user profile. And then the attacker force browsers to authenticated functionality, such as set a password or set the questions and answers. And because that's actually used during the registration process, it may not verify that you are logged in. And so this actually happened against 2 Canadian banks and 1 very large credit agency. And it works because the pattern is the profile is loaded from disk, and this functionality allows you to change that password and change those questions and answers. Okay? The information's there. So the attackers called this the half-open attack, and that's what we've called it as well. Access control, by the way, longer timeouts, up to 30 days. Okay? It just reflects the reality that if you're using LinkedIn on your mobile phone, the days of shared computers are gone, and people do use their mobile phones with apps that stay logged in forever. So every time that we did a code review underneath ASVS 3.01 and you didn't log them out in within 15 minutes, you failed. But that's not realistic. It needs to be per the risk. Now, if the risk is very high, it's still 15 minutes. But at the low end of the scale, you can now pass with up to a 30-day bearer token. So after 30 days, you should ask for the password again. And with modern phones, again, it's starting to worry me about where mine is. With modern phones, it is coming to the place where it is, you can re-authenticate in a half a second just by using a thumbprint or using your face. Access control, we deal with it. It's not much different now. We just cover serverless and cloud access controls. We've made it really clear that access control is about protecting data, and we've got a good section on data protection coming up. This got a huge revamp. We've deduped. There's fewer items in it overall, but we actually have added extra ones, including SSRF, deserialization, XXE, and a few others. Now, 301 did actually mention XXE, but didn't tell you how to do it properly. This time, we actually have separate items for it. We also have JavaScript injection, so not just eval, but also template injection and all sorts of wonderful things. So if you're doing CSP bypasses using Angular or anything like that, the reality is we now have controls that help you get there. Stored cryptography, the main difference is that we actually ask you to data classify. You don't want to encrypt everything. Algorithm agility, there is going to be a time when SHA-3 will probably be not good enough and we'll have to do something about it. I want you to be able to move. Secret management, we finally do acknowledge the existence of hardware security modules, TPMs and others. And in fact, we would like you to use OS key stores over and above, say for example, the Java key store. But Java key store is still better than clear text passwords and config files. So we want you to manage your secrets a bit better. Error handling, we no longer ask you to report on stack traces. Please stop doing that. Unless there's something about a person in a stack trace, it's not important. You're not going to get hacked. They might work out where in the file system you are, but it's not going to be good enough. So it's about reducing the time to detect breaches. It's about making sure that you've got sufficient logging and auditing and escalation in place to be able to reduce that time. Last year's Verizon had it still a tad over half a year. I believe it's gone down a little bit this year, but it's still way too long. In half a year, you can extract a lot of data. And a lot of the really interesting breaches are actors who don't release that information. So just putting it out there. Data protection now covers GDPR. It also covers things like the Australian privacy principles and others that have technical controls associated with them. We basically deal with the concept of not just data disclosure, but unauthorized modification, creation, and deletion. Because in the past, we may not have made that sufficiently clear that A, it's about humans, and B, it's basically around ensuring that, for example, you cannot update someone's medicines. You cannot then, for example, change someone's salary or force them to retire if it's a HR system. We need these protections in there, not just data disclosure. People think about privacy breaches as this is this many records on the internet, but imagine if you're a health insurer and someone's twiddled with your data just ever so little and you've got hundreds of millions of records. What could you trust? You would have to go back to a backup and actually do a data cleanse. It could be months before you're back on the job. Communication security, we've got a complete rewrite. We don't want developers thinking about how to do chain, like validating the certificate chain. That's an operating system problem. If there's a problem with the certificate handling in the operating system, that's not a developer issue. We don't want you to log that the certificate was no good. We do want to go to a place where we have everything TLS'd or encrypted. The days of the interior network, you can connect to it via telnet and the database connection is unencrypted. Those days have been done for years. We are making it part of the actual ASVS now. We want you to use modern configuration builders. So say, for example, if you are doing TLS configuration, we're not going to give you what to do. We're saying go to somewhere like the Mozilla SSL configurator and build a good configuration and then test it with SSL labs, okay? If you get an A+ out of that, your job done. Good work. And, in Amazon, if you're using the ELB, just use the latest profile. That satisfies that requirement, okay? So we don't ask developers to do things they can't do. In Malicious Code, we gave it a good, solid rework. We want to basically get to a place where things like privacy invading libraries are taken care of. That wasn't part of the malicious code section before, and because it was level 3 in the past, people never did it. We want people to start searching for backdoors, time bombs, and permission invading libraries are probably going to be the most common. That's a pervasive problem on the Android platform at the moment. Business logic verification got a great deal of update. We really went to town on this one. We wanted to make sure that the usual sorts of things. How many people's favourite film is Office Space? Okay, I have the red stapler. That's how bad and tragic I am. Office Space has a salami attack built into it. That's the premise of the movie. So we deal with salami attacks. We've always dealt with a salami attack, but the reality is we want you to do it as well. And so you've got to be able to do it in step order. You've got to be able to do it in human time, and there should be business limits, not just technical limits like you can call this API 50 times. What happens if you do 50 transactions of $3 million a piece? That's no good. It really comes down to the combination of velocity plus impact. We want you to think about those things. And finally, about 5 or 6 years ago, I came across the first NIST publication from 1976. It was classified for a time because it taught people how to secure software. It had the equivalent of the OWASP top 10 in there in 1976. And 8 out of the 11 things that are there are in the OWASP top 10. Okay? One of the ones that wasn't in the OWASP top 10 is race conditions. But what do we have today that those guys didn't have back then, that they thought so far ahead? They were doing batch serially on mainframes with tapes. If they were doing a sort, that was basically tape-to-tape sorting. You know, we're talking about that sort of a time. It was very serial. Those guys thought about distributed computing and race conditions before it was a thing. We now have laptops like this one that have 8 cores. You know, if you look at a modern server, you're looking at 70-something cores. If you then put Node.js on it, it pretends to be single-threaded. It's absolutely not single-threaded. It's really important that we know that Java and some of our major frameworks are multi-threaded by default and that we take care of it. We've put that back in. Actually, we put it in for the first time. That's going to be hard. We talk about it in terms of shared state. We'll work on that in the future versions, but fundamentally, if you've got shared state and multi-threading, you've got a problem. Files and resources is the next one. We gave it a bit of a revamp. We basically wanted to make it easier to comply with. Too many times, files and resources, it just mentioned LFI and RFI and didn't tell you what to do about those things. We now tell you what to do about them. We split them out a little bit. We also talk about SSRF in some detail. We also talk about DTT processing and other things. So it makes it a lot better and much easier to comply with from a developer point of view. API security, total revamp. We threw the old one out. We got rid of a gdupe, and we basically made a RESTful section, a SOAP section, and a GraphQL section, which we've also called Web Service Data Layers, because GraphQL will not be the first or the last web service data layer. Okay? It's a very important technology for those doing React, but there are other technologies other than React, and things like GraphQL will continue to come up. And for those who've not dealt with GraphQL before, think about web-based database queries. You've basically got select star from built into an API you can call. And you can think about all the security problems we've always had with that. It's back again. And so what we need to do here is actually get to a place where GraphQL is safe. And the last chapter that's in the ASVS is configuration. We've changed this around so that it's got far fewer items that make no difference, and it's got far more items that make a huge impact. For example, the first one is we want you to have a repeatable build process. We want you to do the configuration as part of your build. That way you can deploy a development system, an UAT system, an A versus B system, and a production system in a few seconds, and it's secure by default because it's the same controls in each of those environments. We also talk about sandboxing. We also talk about dependency checks. We want you to use dependency checkers to actually make sure that you don't go live with vulnerable components. And lastly, one of the things that's in bug bounties that's a huge payout for lots of folks right now is subdomain takeovers. We finally have a section on subdomain takeover. So if you use cloud-based services and don't control the DNS, someone else can come in behind you and take over that, watch what comes through, and then potentially take over systems. I have a friend who does that, and, well, anyway, let's just say that one of the programs he does is a frequent flyer program, and every time he wants to fly somewhere, he hacks them a little bit more with the subdomain takeover and gets a fair number of points. He keeps on doing it until he's actually got enough points to fly where he wants to go. So it's a common thing in bug bounties. It's not very common in pen testing. I'd like you to get used to it. Okay, I'm in. How do I use it? Well, there's so many different ways. When we started the ASVS about 10 years ago, it was originally the secure coding checklist at Aspect Security, plus some other things that Mike Boberski brought in. Mike and Jeff Williams and Dave Wickers, they built this entire thing and they donated it to the community. They did hold some things back, such as the shared memory stuff and distributed computing stuff, because even back then, Aspect was, quite advanced. Fair warning, I did work for them at the time. Since then, we've gone past just secure code review. You can use it for pen testing, you can use it for agile, you can actually use it for constraints, DevOps, you can actually use it as a benchmark for your tools. How many of level 1 can your tool detect? Yeah? So you can now objectively measure that. You can also use it for things like deployment checklists and saying, for example, have I built a test or a hardening for this thing? And when you're doing planning sprints, how many people here have seen OWASP Cornucopia or the Microsoft Elevation of Privilege game? Depressingly none. Okay, if you're in Agile, how many people do Agile work? A few of you, good. Agile folks basically had this concept if you ain't gonna need it. Now, what that meant to them is that they ain't going to need documentation, so they stopped doing that. You ain't going to need architecture because we do it every sprint. You ain't going to need... And you just go... I actually managed to catch up with one of the guys who actually founded the Agile Manifesto. And they never meant to get rid of these things because you are going to need it, but they weren't very specific about what they weren't going to need. And people just went too far. So the enterprise architecture function has disappeared in most Agile workplaces. And that's a shame because, I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a single well-honed authentication piece, everything that uses that doesn't have to do authentication, and it just works. So enterprise architecture can more than pay for itself, and it's sad that it's gone. With sprint planning, the idea is that we can actually, threat modeling should be there. If it's not, it's one of those areas like I had a limited number of things I could put on the slide. It needs to be there. You can use the ASVS.
Yeah, that is one of the practice which we need to follow for security practice.
Yeah, it's the second item in the ASVS. Threat modeling is the second item.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so there's two ways. I have told you that level 1 has 160-something controls, and that may be way too much for you. Grab it, fork it, delete the things you don't care about. Make your own version of level 1. If, for example, you're a bank and you find the things that are in level 3 that apply to you, but you don't want to do level 3, fork it, delete the things that you don't want out of level 3, and then put the things that are still in level 3 into level 2. Make it your own. I want you to do that. It's designed to be customized any way you want. The actual PDF that I generated this morning, you can generate yourself, you can make your own version. It's got a CSV generator, so for the people who have tools, you can now grab the CSV that contains the exact text, the exact thing, the exact CWE, and import it directly. Okay, so you can make your own version and then export it into your favorite thing straight away. Deep standards have no bounds. Use it the way you want. You may want to use it as by default. I'm happy for that too. How to get involved. As an OWASP project, we're open source. We want you to get involved. At the very least, we need translations. If you speak a different language other than English, please contact us. We have a process for doing that. It's very straightforward. It just takes a long time. 2 to 4 weeks worth of effort, depending on how fast you can type. We need more case studies. If you actually use the ASVS, we want to put the case studies into the wiki and keep them up to date. How do people actually use the ASVS in real life? Create issues. Or if you notice something and you want to fix it, create a pull request. We'll evaluate it, and the next time we come out with a new version, if we merge, it's there. We absolutely accept all contributions. Where can you get it? Well, you saw me deploy it before. It's available now on GitHub. After this talk, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to put it up on the wiki. You can actually follow us in the development. We're not going to make any changes for a little while because I personally need a break. But if you follow Master, Master will always be the latest version. This presentation, by the way, is also in GitHub. If you want to give this talk at your workplace or at your OWASP chapter or at your nullcon chapter, whatever it is, you can give this same presentation. Thank you. I will take questions. I believe I'm a tad early, but I've got 5 minutes for questions. And while we're doing that, no. I heard a phone.
Lunch.
Apple Watches, you've got to love them. Was there any questions? No? Well, I'm here today and tomorrow. If you see me out and about, do just grab me. I'm pretty easy to spot. Thank you.